And it's with great pleasure now that I give over the podium to Fred Gardafé from the Columbia Institute in New York. It's a great honour to have him here and to chair this session. Fred?
Thank you very much. It is my pleasure this morning to introduce to you Rita WILSON, who is a professor of translation studies in the School of Languages, Literatures and Cultures and Linguistics, and deputy dean, Faculty of Arts at Monash. It's the same language, but somehow we in America, and the English are always yelling at us for getting it wrong. Her research combines an interest in linguistic and cultural translation and multilingualism with studies of contemporary translingual and transcultural writing. Most recently, her publications have focused on the relationship between self-translation, migration, and the construction of cultural identities. Rita is the academic co-director of the Monash Warwick Migration, Identity, and Translation Research Network with Loredana Polezzi, and she is the co-editor of the journal The Translator. And her talk today is entitled Sites of Translation, Stories of Mobility, Place, and Cultural Identity. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm a little short, so I may have to adjust this a little bit. Can you hear me? Yes. No? Yes?
A little bit closer. You'll have to be a bit closer.
I think I can do this one. I used to work in the rock and roll.
Okay. This is what I like, lots of attention. First of all, thanks very much for making the effort to be here at this really early hour of the morning. I appreciate it. I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land and their ancestors past, present and future. And I just wanted to mention that I'll be continuing today in my talk on the storytelling theme that we touched on in yesterday's evening, quite inspiring opening session. It'll be a very different kind of approach to storytelling, but I hope that it will resonate in some way. So my talk will center on representations of the effects of Italy in movement, both towards and away and within the geographical borders of the peninsula. In particular, I'm going to be looking at some transcultural spaces produced by the increased transnational mobility and new settlements in Milano, Roma, and Melbourne through these literary representations. In recent decades, the realities of urban multilingualism have become increasingly evident in cities around the world, whether it be through the multilingual signage on commercial and place name signs in urban areas, or in polyglot conversations on public transport. To date, the way in which knowledge of in and of the city is shaped by linguistic and oral aspects has been largely neglected in favor of the visual. Lately, however, there has been an upsurge of interest in this notion of the translation zone. These can be defined as urban areas of intense interaction across languages, spaces defined by an acute consciousness of cultural negotiations, divided and contested urban spaces where language relations are regulated by the opposing forces of coercion and resistance. Translation zones question received ideas of foreignness because members of diverse cultures become neighbors and share a single territory. And I'm going to argue that local sites within these translation zones could be thought of as in-translation, belonging to no single, discrete cultural or ethnic group. I'm particularly interested in how fiction can inflect perceptions of the real, and on the impact that imagined spaces can have on the construction of urban space that we encounter in our daily experiences. The idea that literary discourse is one of the discursive forms that interact with the perception and production of space and consequently modify it is central to geocritical approaches that consider fiction and its real-world referent to be inseparable. Geocriticism, as proposed by French scholar Bernard Westphal, assumes a literary referentiality between world and text, and has a clear methodology built around four key concepts. Multifocalization, which consists of comparing different cultural representations of a specific place. and often juxtaposes an endogenous perspective, that is, that of the native city dweller, with an allogenous perspective, that of the, for example, the migrant or the migrant writer. Polysensoriality, which requires looking at different sense perceptions described in the text, not only the visual aspect, as I mentioned earlier. Stratigraphy, got that right, refers to the unearthing of different historical and archaeological strata of the representation of place and intertextuality. And here Westphal expands the traditional meaning of the term intertextuality to describe the interaction between real-world spaces and space in literature. The writer effectively becomes the author of his city or her city, and a given representation, and as Westphal says, especially possibly a fictional one, eventually acts upon the real, affecting the way it is perceived. I'm quite taken with this approach because I think it helps us to understand the situated social dynamics of multivocality in local places, and how they manifest in the contesting lives of multiple publics, polylingual, multicultural, and multi-ethnic. Stories of migration lend themselves very well to geocritical analysis, not least because they are stories that unfold on specific local communities, are told through people's everyday life, practices, experiences, relationships, and so on, which are inevitably attached to particular places. The condition of an immigrant's integration are determined by the particular local environment where they settle. Labor market experiences on the, labor market integration depends on the structures of the local economy. Their residential experiences depends on the local housing market, and the degree to which they are generally accepted or not is related to socio-cultural peculiarities, including the public discourse on immigration and the level of development of inclusive civil society institutions locally. For the migrants themselves, the locality where they settle becomes their place. For the local communities, the presence of immigrants, whether it brings visible or less obvious changes, challenges established uses of space, alters its landscape, and questions its identity. Geographer Tom Hall has suggestively argued that rather than a setting to be navigated, local place is that through which and with which lives take shape, and that biographies of place and life are intimately interwoven. Despite the increase of global mobility, place, emplacement, and locality remain important in many different ways, and in fact, many will argue that mobility is a crucial factor defining of place and locality. Local places are fraught and contested constructions, complex, multi-layered, and any physical space will host many different micro-publics, living together in what one scholar has called proximities of difference. Places themselves are constantly changing, not only with new building constructions, but also as patterns of migration alter the physical, cultural, and linguistic landscape of a site. My aim today is to examine how polyphonic urban spaces shape an individual's experience of the city. I'm going to try and do so through a reading of works that comprise a visual and textual remapping of the author's private relationship to the transcultural spaces they inhabit. In what follows, I'm going to give a very brief overview of three recent literary narratives, then move into exploring how discourses of belonging are narrated in these texts and enacted in the fictional characters or in the author's personal navigation through the spaces. In conjunction with this, I introduce some theoretical and methodological constructs with which to approach how place determines a reading of belonging or identity, and I will conclude by offering some suggestions on what literary narratives might contribute to a politics of local civility. In recent decades, under the economic conditions of globalization, increased migration flows have introduced new cultural and linguistic diversity into previously more apparently homogeneous communities. One of the consequences of these movements and new settlements is a renewed aspiration for civic engagement, which in turn has resulted in new literary forms, such as, for example, the so-called docufiction, in which facts and fictions are melded in interesting ways. At the same time, we have witnessed the phenomenon of how a new generation of graphic novels is portraying migration. To illustrate these transcultural trends, I've selected 3 texts by writers who have hybrid, double identities, hyphenated identities, however you want to call them. Gabriella Curuvilla, born in Milan, Indian father, Italian mother. Ijaba Shego, born in Rome from Somali parents, and Joshua Santo Spirito, born in Melbourne, who's a 4th generation descendant of Aeolian migrants. Excuse me a second. Published between 2012 and 2015, 2 of these books are examples of docufiction, Milano fin qui tutto bene by Curuvilla and Roma negata, percorsi postcoloniali nella città by Ijaba Shego. The third is a graphic novella, Swallows Part 1, published in 2015 by Joshua Santo Spirito. All 3 are at the intersection between personal recollections and historical account. Curuvilla and Shego employ what Michael Cronin has called a politics of microspection to investigate multi-ethnic localities and their inhabitants, focusing on the critical portrayal of how transnational migrations have been affecting Italy and transforming contemporary Italian society and Italian identity as a whole. Both Milano fin qui tutto bene and Roma negata are the results of collaborations with professional photographers. The stories in Milano emerge from a decision by Curuvilla and photographer Silvia Azzarri to explore the ghettoized districts affected by new bylaws limiting nighttime opening hours for shops. These were introduced by local administration, as many of you will know, as a measure to preserve public safety after a series of inter-ethnic riots erupted following the murder of a young Egyptian man in February 2010 in Milan. Curuvilla's aim was to gather first-hand accounts of the everyday life in these constantly transforming neighborhoods. The result is a multifocal, polysensorial narrative structured around the distinctive topography of cultures found in 4 districts in Milan: Via Padova, Via Lemonza, Via Sarpi, and Piazzale Corvetto, each of which offers a glimpse of the complex pattern of socio-cultural interactions in these super diverse communities. The accompanying photos by Silvia Azzarri, 4 photos placed at the start of each of the 4 chapters, visually reinforce the geometric distribution of the narrative. Like Curuvilla, Shego organizes her narrative spatially. 3 of the 6 chapter titles specifically reference a monument or a site that acts as a medium for colonial memories, and they are Le 500 Afriche di un capolinea romano, L'obelisco della discordia, and A file una vergogna nazionale. Composed in collaboration with photographer Rino Bianchi, Roma negata is a work of creative non-fiction that chronicles the traces left by by Italy's colonial past on its urban fabric. Together, Shego and Bianchi revisit some of the symbolic sites in Rome, monuments, buildings, and their place names, that bear traces of the Italian colonial enterprise in the Horn of Africa in the period following Italian unification and during fascism. To counter the erasure of Italy's historical relation to Africa from Italian national memory, they revision Italian history through a creative remapping of the urban space of Rome from the perspective of what Edouard Glissant has termed a prophetic vision of the past, according to which the past has not only to be narrated by the historian, but also to be imagined in a prophetic way for those communities and cultures whose past has been kept hidden or neglected. This multifocal stratigraphic narrative situates the place and role of migrants, especially those from the Italian former colonies of the Horn of Africa, not only within the living present of Italy, but also within the less audible and visible traces they have left in the country's past. The photos taken by Bianchi show present-day migrants in the same multiply inflected sites that Shego narrates, such as the one in front of Cinema Impero, or the other one on the slide, which is in front of the inscription on Ponte Principe Amedeo, which is dedicated to the valor of the fascist imperial enterprise in East Africa. In this way, Bianchi and Schenkel managed to link Italy's colonial past to the present-day migration and multiculturalism. Like Roma Negata, the third text can be read through a stratigraphic lens. But more specifically, it brings to the fore the intertextual element. The spaces in Swallows Part 1 encompass or interface with other spaces in film, art, and reality. Described as a poetic novella, Swallows Part 1 tells the story of the author's Aeolian ancestors. It describes the voyage of the author's paternal great-grandfather, Antonino Santo Spirito, who migrated to Australia from the Aeolian Islands in 1892, after the phylloxera destroyed the majority of vine varieties, causing a collapse of the local economy and the immigration of about 50% of these islands, of the population of these islands. However, the real protagonist of the story is his son Antonio, who supported his family by running a successful flower stall, who from the age of 6, as you'll see, they were selling newspapers on the streets of Melbourne, and from the age of about 14 was running a flower stall and had 3 people working for him, just to give you a sense of the spirit of this entrepreneur. As the years went by, Antonio built a network of wholesalers across Australia, his business flourished, and he became famously known as the King of Flowers on Flinders Street. While the story of Antonio's wife, Lena Virgona, known as La Mamma degli Italiani, was well known due to her extensive welfare work for the Catholic Church, for the Italian-Australian community, the story of the successful but very shy entrepreneur was hardly known at all, until Joshua's father, Anthony, wrote, quote, a little booklet in which he recounted the story of his father's life, and he gave this to his children. This family memoir is literally the pretext, the text that is the precursor to Swallows. And Swallows is about a deeply personal experience of migration and what it means to pull up your roots from one place on the other side of the world and start weaving them into the new world. But it is also a story that resonates much more widely. As Joshua Santos Spirito says, I'm using my family's story to talk about how immigrants weave themselves within the fabric of the city that they've moved to. The urban fabric in which migration stories unfold is characterized by the existence of different cultures, which reshape the urban linguistic landscapes, as I've said, and contribute to the creation of new personal, social, and professional identities, new relations in neighborhoods and cities, and between public authority and civil society. Literary narratives, like the ones under discussion, I'm going to argue, offer a new angle of approach to the multiform forces that create translational city spaces. By deploying narrative practices that accentuate the movement and the texture of discursive interactions in situations where established residents are surprised and dismayed by the rapid and deep transformations in their neighborhood brought about by the arrival of newcomers. This is well illustrated in Milano Fin Qui Tutto Bene, in which Kuruvilla pays particular attention to the contrast between the established residents and the incomers as manifested in everyday practices in public spaces. For the residents, the streets, squares, and parks have become mere spaces of transit, or spaces to be avoided, like the example on the slide of Parco delle Rose, which, since it's become a kind of salotto, the resident who's telling the story doesn't go there anymore. Ci vanno gli altri, only the others go there. The new arrivals, on the other hand, are making productive use of these social spaces, as the example taken from Via Crespi, where particularly in the summer months, and I'll paraphrase, North Africans, Chinese, Filipinos, South Americans, Romanians, Bangladeshi, Indians, Sri Lankans all go outdoors. I bambini giocano nei cortili, le donne chiacchierano, and so on. Macro discourses of spatialization about urban centers are reflected at the local level in the defensive reaction of residents, often, and often these are rhetorically grounded in the existence of a more or less imagined community and the construction of socio-spatial boundaries that shape neighborhood belonging and mark exclusion or partial inclusion of those considered outsiders. On the one hand, ethnic communities emerge historically as a permanent source of protection from fears of insecurity, isolation, estrangement, and intrusion of aliens. On the other hand, the urban landscaping can reify a politics of difference that favors us, identities, meanings, and practices of dominant cultural groups, while marginalizing and excluding them, practices, knowledges, and identities of the other. As illustrated in the portrayal of the neighborhood on Via Paolo Sarpi, known as Milan's Chinatown, it consists of a dedalo di stradine in cui ci si perde, situato poco lontano dal Duomo, ma è come essere nel centro di Pechino. Here the narrator is Stefania, a Milanese self-employed photographer, so here we have the endogenous perspective, whose photographs document the popular perception of the Chinese living in Milan as a closed, silent, introverted community. They rarely speak Italian with the locals and pass quickly through the streets come se fossero qui, ma si trovassero altrove, ancora in Cina, e forse in Cina probabilmente siamo. Stefania recalls the early Chinese arrivals in the 1920s when a nonna lived in Via Bramante. The difference now, though, is if you live in Via Paolo Sarpi, the neighborhood is not recognizable anymore. The appearance of extraneous foreign presences have taken the place of historical shops, changing the aspect of the streets. The development of the Chinese community is portrayed as a form of double encapsulation. On the one hand, maintaining a strong presence and anchor inside the community as part of the intra-ethnic social relations, and on the other, being part of the global Chinese cultural flow that crosses continents and whose identification is supported through numerous commercial activities. And you'll see the long list of commercial activities on the slide, starting from the phone center multifunzionali che di notte possono diventare dormitori, simply by moving the chairs around, and up to the agenzie di viaggi, centri di massaggi, e ai negozi di high-tech. Importantly, tutti con insegne cinesi e commessi cinesi, così che tu che sei italiano non ci capisci nulla di quello che leggi e senti. And I can't speak Milanese, but you'll see in the Milanese dialect it seems as if you're illiterate, because it's as if you went to school on Thursdays, and on Thursdays the schools were closed, so you learned nothing. So you can't read or understand anything you see or hear. So in a mixture of standard Italian and Milanese dialects, Stefania reflects on how native Italians are excluded from the intimate, individual Asian topography of the neighborhood. While Stefania's narrow viewpoint fails to take into account that any non-Mandarin speaker is similarly excluded, her remark serves as a reminder that the linguistic landscape provides a unique perspective on the coexistence and competition of different languages and cultures, and how these interact and interfere with each other in a given place. Indeed, public and commercial signs can be used to reinforce a collective identity, or as Ben Raphael puts it, they may be designed to assert, quote, their actors' particularist identities, who they are in front of who they are not, exhibiting thereby an a priori commitment to a given group within the general public, end quote. It's commonly understood that apart from indexing a particular linguistic community, the act of displaying a language, especially on official or local government signage, carries important symbolic function of increasing its value and its status. Thus, the presence and dominance of one language over another, in frequency of occurrence or in prominence of display, may indicate the relative demographic, as in this case, or institutional power of an ethno-linguistic group over another. Here, Via Paolo Sarpi could be considered representative of a site of transculturation in which the power relations between, in this instance, Chinese and Italian residents are constantly renegotiated. The use of the Milanese dialect in this example shifts the emphasis from what Michael Cronin has called the translational to the translocational. and makes the links between language, place, and personal identity even more explicit. The local dialects and accents highlight the complex intersection of the local and global that occur in this highly stratified, multi-ethnic society, and are reflected in the everyday language practices of its characters and its residents. In addition to the traces of local regional Italian dialects, which of course are the result of historic internal migration in Italy, and which coexist with inflections and words from the immigrants' ethnic languages, language in these multicultural neighborhoods are now influenced by varieties of English and a range of global subcultures. An example, and I'm not going to read this whole slide, I just ask you to look at the colorful bits in it. An example is the character of Tony in Milano, whose entire personality is characterized by his translanguaging practices. He uses Neapolitan dialect because his family is from Naples. He's learned some Milanese dialect because he lives in Corvetto, where there is still a strong sense of Milanesità. But nowadays, one also encounters in this district a profusion of English, slang, along with Jamaican patois. Now, I've used this example because it has a little bit of each of those elements in it. The frequency of the shift of language is much greater in the dialogues between the characters in the novel, but I wanted to use this example because it focuses on how language in space regulates behavior. And what I mean by this is that if you look at about the middle of the slide, you'll see a reference to the bowling club, the bowling center in Corvetto, in which the immigrants are only allowed access to the first floor where the slot machines are located. And so that's one example of how it regulates behavior. There is another really obvious example in the novel, which I haven't put up here, or in the book, which I haven't put up here, which is a place called the Scheherazade Cafe, where Italians are not welcome because all the clients speak French and Arabic. So it's quite a good example of, or these are, for me, a very obvious example of how language is used to regulate behavior and set up these divided spaces. Spaces that reproduce particular social values like privacy versus community, or where power relations are brought to the fore. So the conduct, in other words, in these public spaces is a constant reminder of the proximity of difference. And this proximity of difference is also something that happens fleetingly. People are brought into all kinds of proximate relationships, often by chance and often for very brief moments. These brief chance encounters can evoke an array of emotions and memories that often create a defamiliarizing effect. As seen, for example, in Roma Negata, in which Cego and Bianchi take the reader on a guided tour of famous Roman landmarks, with the aim of uncovering hidden or silenced histories of Italian colonialism. And the shot is from the video that introduces the book, and it's actually, the subtitling is of the voiceover, and this is what Cego says: Cammino, lo faccio sempre quando qualche pensiero. And in fact, the whole book is about her walking through these spaces and commenting on the route that they've taken. So the methodology that she and Bianco employ is a version of the so-called commented walks that involves the production of narratives and accompanying reflections when walking in a place. Cego and Bianchi focus on the ways in which walking as a sensory experience facilitates memory, biography, and identity as emplaced. Cego guides the reader around different districts in Rome and characterizes them each in turn from the point of view of what one ought to know about a particular zone. The accompanying black and white photographs taken by Bianchi point to a temporal and spatial distance that nevertheless comes back to be embodied in those migrants from former colonies inhabiting the present-day urban spaces of the Italian city. The project is deliberately aimed at producing a sense of estrangement and disorientation in the spectator or reader, as she is compelled to confront a common past that has always been there, but which has to a large degree been silenced, and is now resurfacing uncannily in the faces of the new Italians occupying these public spaces. Cego imagines herself at the intersection of trajectories that originate from specific places in Italy and represent a starting point for alternative routes. So this is telling the story from the alternative perspective. It's part of that multifocalization I mentioned earlier. She also, I mean, I like this quote because it reinforces my argument about being ossessionata da luoghi. I'm a bit ossessionata myself dai luoghi. But the important thing I wanted to draw attention to here is that because she can't forget this, non la posso dimenticare io questa storia, she feels compelled to tell the story. And it's a little bit this resonating of needing to tell the stories that have not been told, that have been silenced, that is coming through in this book as well. The first site we encounter as readers is Piazza Porta Capena. Now, many of you will know that this is the site that is now marked by the absence of the Stela of Axum, which was the obelisk taken from Ethiopia in 1937 as part of the spoils of war following the Italian conquest of the colony. The monument was erected in Piazza Porta Capena to celebrate the 15th anniversary of the March on Rome as a glorification of the new Roman Empire. It was returned to Ethiopia only in 2005 after a long and painful negotiation. In 2009, 2 Roman columns, which you can see on the right of the slide, were placed in the square as a memorial to those who died in the events of 9/11. The multifocalization adopted by Shego and Bianchi through words and images implies not only a negotiation between individual representations or recollections of one and the same space, but also of their intersections. Here, the intersection of architecture and language forms an even more complex, multi-layered cityscape, and we can discern the stratification created by succeeding layers of building or writing. The plaque at the base of the column is inscribed with an aphorism by George Santayana, which is those who don't know how to remember the past are condemned to repeat it. It was placed there to commemorate the victims of any kind of political violence. But for Shego, the ongoing absence of any kind of monument to those who died in Italy's colonies clearly shows that, I'm quoting, not every memory is treated the same. There are memorie di serie A and memorie di serie B. Bianchi and Shego highlight the extent to which previous strata of cultural coding underlie the present surface, and each waits to be uncovered and read, like traces in a palimpsest. Obviously, places and monuments play an important role, and I like this quote by Giuliana Grechi and Gravano, who point out that the monuments and places are seen as living entities participating in a precarious contemporaneity that hangs over in a present imperfect temporality, a time in between a past that still lingers in the present. A second powerful example of this present imperfect is constituted by Piazza dei Cinquecento. Again, many of you will know that the square is named to commemorate the 430 Italian soldiers who died defeated at the 1887 Battle of Dogali in Eritrea. This was the site also where the actor is actually standing on the plinth, was the site of the Stela of Dogali until 1925, when the monument was moved to the Terme di Diocleziano. Nowadays, the Piazza dei Cinquecento, situated in front of Stazione Termini, is deemed by Shego to be the true center of Rome. She calls it, as you can see from the quote, l'ombelico di Roma, da dove si parte per andare altrove o semplicemente dietro l'angolo. And then she notes that by accident, almost, this has become a post-colonial center. It's become the Piazza dei Migranti. I would also argue that this new Babel, as she calls it, because it's a paradigmatic site of travel and exchange, is really an exemplary site of translation. And this image is underlined by the bottom part of the quote, in which she notes that in una Babele folle di lingue si intrecciano e si contaminano con la lingua di Dante. So we actually have quite a clear description of how the languages are being fragmented and recomposed constantly in this site. Memory here functions as an act of recall that reconstructs forgotten history. and sometimes forgotten or no longer existing spaces. Central to this project are the multiple kinds of memory, personal and familial memories, as well as a critique of forgetting, which appears here as Italy's collective amnesia for its own colonial history. But there is also a shared transnational memory that is forged through the movement and contact of people, or what Rothberg calls multi-directional memory. This is a concept that, I'm quoting, posits collective memory as partially disengaged from exclusive versions of cultural identity, and acknowledges how remembrance cuts both across and binds together different spatial, temporal, and cultural sites, end of quote. Is of particular relevance, I think, to diasporic contexts, as it draws attention to the dynamic transfers that take place between diverse places and times during acts of remembrance. And here I'm coming to my final example. In Swallows, there are a number of instances in which we are reminded about how memories connect old and new places. This is just one example in which the author is having a conversation with a friend of his who happens to come from Germany, and she notes that she used to know all these place names, but now all these memories in her head and they're useless. But actually, as he comments in a later moment, these are names that are important to be passed on to her descendants who might go back and then be looking at these place names. So again, we're reminded of how immigration not only changes the place that the migrants arrive at, but changes the places they leave from. Far from the other element I want to just mention briefly here is that the interesting thing about telling migration stories in graphic novel form is that the images provide the story that runs through the text with additional and at times even alternative narratives, and facilitate an interpretation of the depicted world that is much more multi-layered than is to be found in traditional narrative genres such as the short story or the novel. Now, in Swallows, there is an abundance of both verbal and visual intertextualities that makes it part of what I would argue is a 21st century global community. The intertextual features suggest the difficulty of capturing the enormity of the migrational shift in one narrative, the need to include other stories to fill the gaps in migration narratives, and offer a sense of the nuances contained within a single person's experiences of migration. Intertextual encounters generate radical, and to recall Edward Said, liberating energies that allow redefinition of subjectivities, where the stories touch other stories. As Joshua discovered more about his grandfather through the booklet written by his father Anthony, he began to feel his ancestors reflected in the city that they had moved to and had been changed by, and had in turn been changed with their arrival. And in an interview, he recounts how a return visit to Melbourne allows him to an even more intimate encounter with his heritage, as his father guided him through the footsteps of his ancestors, explaining the significance of the various family sites. And in this example, you have the location of the first house in Bouverie Street, which has become, as you can see, the sense of layering that is created through the storytelling here. An exemplary iconic site is the location of the flower stand, which was in a laneway behind the Young and Jackson Hotel. Now, the Melburnians will know exactly what I'm talking about. The interesting thing about this is that it is itself a kind of transitional and liminal place. What Joshua says about this is that every time I walk past the laneway behind Young and Jackson, I can feel the presence of my grandfather. So I kind of like the idea that my ancestors are sort of still here and I can get to know them. Now, this liminal site touches another migration story. The story is that of Chloe, which is the subject of the famous portrait in the Young and Jackson's Hotel. And it's recounted here in Swallows. It's a young Parisian novel. All we know about her was that she was called Marie. She was immortalized by one of the famous painters of the time, Jules Joseph Lefebvre, and the portrait is entitled Chloe. We don't know much about her except that she was about 19 when she was painted, and about 2 years later she committed suicide by drinking a soup of boiled matches. Awful. Probably because of unrequited love. And again, this story is recounted briefly in the novel. Chloe made her debut as the portrait in a Paris salon in 1875, won the gold medal, won acclaim by critics and the general public, and as Joshua puts it, in 1879, disguised as a painting, she emigrated to a distant land. So in fact, the painting was exhibited in Sydney and Melbourne and Adelaide in 1879, 1880 and 1883. In 1909, Henry Young bought the painting, and for more than 100 years, Chloe and Young and Jackson's have become inextricably linked as part of Melbourne's heritage, becoming icons and attractions for tourists and locals alike. And there she is in Young and Jackson's, and it's near Flinders Street, so you can pop up and have a drink in the pub. In one of the passages of Swallows, which is the author Joshua sits on the Flinders Street station stairs and chats with Marie or Chloe, and you can see this conversation. It's both a playful but a contemplative moment, and Joshua's story gains this additional resonance through the story of Chloe, which is both the migration of an object representative of a life story. It's an interface between the story of a girl, the story of a portrait, and the story of a place. It's a great example of intertextuality. It also interacts with today's reality. It's still there, people talk about it all the time. And it's a good example of how the comic form literalizes time on a page, going from the distant past there to the present here. What I like about it is that in this alternative space, we've also captured voices that are not commonly heard, those so-called eccentric voices, those voices outside of the mainstream. And it does so in a range of original visual grammars that allows these stories to be told. I particularly like the fact that the building sings to the author, and it's this resonating echoing of the stories that I interpret by looking at this. So Swallows is also a story of a city, told from the perspective of all of the stories that built it are now embedded in it. The use of intertextual references, while opening up archived pages of cultural and collective history, offer numerous examples of intercultural roots among people, cultures, and languages, and underscores how everyone weaves stories together in the landscape that surrounds us. And as Joshua said in an interview, it's really unifying to know that migrants' personal stories, all of migrants' personal stories, shape the city they now live in. So I'm going to wrap up in a couple of minutes. The multisensory, multifocal, and stratified and intertextual perspective adopted by these three authors concretely contributes, I want to argue, to the disruption of stereotypes, of fixed notions of national, ethnic belonging by uncovering forgotten, hidden stories of individuals, and of other worlds that sustain the construction of contemporary identities and culture. There are a couple of points I want to make which I think are useful to think about for future studies of cultural contact. Firstly, these are polyphonic literary representations, plurilingual if you like, or polylingual as Loredana would prefer, that offer us paradigms of plural societies and give insights into crucial questions of our time. These highly detailed personal readings of the everyday life in multi-ethnic open spaces show how changes to the political and economic macro level, the so-called big issues, are manifested in local language practices and personal experiences. And I think they offer a much more nuanced understanding of the intricate relationship between language and mobility in transcultural urban societies. Secondly, we can think about, if we're aware of these language usages, we can think of cities as iconospheres, in which tensions between globalizing and localizing displays of words and images reveal competing voices of overlapping communities, contending for visibility and for economic and political survival. It's not just what the fictional characters say, it is the translanguaging practices that they deploy in response to their environment that shapes the perception of the transcultural neighborhood as sites of translation, transitional zones that influence their cultures of origin by increasing diversity. And recognizing the value of diversity enhances the resilience of local societies as well. I think the work of these authors points the way to how we can study culture in a way that it responds to practices of human mobility and cultural exchange, how the cultural and the transcultural cannot be studied in isolation, but but rather need to be seen as a part of a complex system of circulation which goes beyond national boundaries or linguistic discreteness. Transcultural spaces, as I've argued, are characterized by a relation of visibility that sustains a very different kind of place than the erstwhile piazza. Here, on the one hand, these spaces sustain multiple publics, the various subgroups within immigrant and native communities, to communicate and become involved with each other, as the examples offered by Sheko and Kuruvilla. On the other hand, it allows each individual to interpret and recreate these spaces in different personalized ways, as we've seen in the example by Santo Spirito. The intertwined transcultural spaces change the way that we describe multi-ethnic space. No longer are ethnic communal places principally a site of difference. They need to be reconceptualized as urban places that are complexly networked and transacted by multiple social and cultural boundaries. Hybrid diasporic identities emerge in the nodal points of this network. Because here one faces and translates the other, meaning and identity can no longer be the same. In spaces of flow, identities shuttle, as it were, between and across constructed boundaries, producing new meanings and new transcultural textual practices. Finally, sociologists and geographers concerned with social and urban policy have argued that policies for multicultural living need to connect much more closely with sensory aspects of affect, event, and encounter. This entails more open understandings of people's sense of place, and how this accords with ideas of nation, region, home, or locality as geographically located and emotionally experienced. In other words, new emotional geographies of place can be deployed in the service of a revitalized politics of civility. Literary representations such as these get at a kind of polyphonic or dialogical understanding of the chosen place. One that is not, to be sure, not objective, since absolute objectivity is an epistemological impossibility, but that is able to transcend the limited, subjective, ethnocentric perspectives of individual authors and the interpretative communities to which they belong, enabling us to deterritorialize the stereotypical views of place and belonging and the illusion of permanence suggested by received wisdom and hegemonic discourses. More and more in the world we live in, we see our environment as Deserteur put it, an instantaneous configuration of positions, one that we are required to make sense of as much as to act in. Narrative is our faithful standby in this task. To use it well, we need to focus not only on place and what we mean by that word, but on the other's notions of that word, and how we describe and inscribe and interpret the meaning of our own movements and those of others in these places. And I leave you with this relatively recent storytelling initiative by Radio Orvieto Web, who believes, which is actually an invitation for us to listen to the stories of all of the migrants, both migranti di antico e di nuovo insediamento, and invites us to consider how such storytelling could be un invito alla solidarietà attiva e civile. Thank you.